During the time of the Exodus, it's estimated that there was somewhere around 2 to 3 million Semites in Egypt. Now, if you talk to Egyptologists and archaeologists and ask them if there's any evidence for this massive population of Semites, future Israelites in Egypt during that time, the time of the Exodus, they will say there's none. Is there any evidence for the conquest of Canaan that followed shortly thereafter? They will answer none. Now, the question then needs to be asked, is it time to chuck our Bibles to the side and give up our faith? Or perhaps is there something else going on here? Are they looking in the wrong spots? Are they looking in the wrong time period? Today, we're going to be talking to documentarian and filmmaker Timothy Mahoney about his new film, Patterns of Evidence. Welcome to the Youth Apologetics Training Podcast. All right. Well, like I said in the introduction, we're going to be talking about this film, Patterns of Evidence, with the filmmaker Timothy Mahoney. Guys, I picked this up at Walmart. Believe it or not, you can actually get this at Walmart. You can find it on Amazon. I feel like I missed out on the game a little bit late here because this is an excellent film. Wow, what a ride. And you get to see so many of these amazing finds and discoveries firsthand. Timothy Mahoney does an excellent job with this film, showing some of the most recent finds that really is stirring up the field of archaeology right now. You're not going to want to miss this. So, Timothy Mahoney, welcome to the Youth Apologetics Training Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Tim, okay, so I stumbled upon this film of yours, Patterns of Evidence, and I love biblical archaeology, and it's always bugged me that, for the most part, there's very little archaeology that has been discovered that supports this story of the Exodus. I have reported on the Ipuru. Wait, did I just say that word right?
Yeah.
Ipur.
Yeah, good. We could also say admonitions of an Egyptian sage, Ipur, or the admonitions of an Egyptian sage. Those are two different ways to speak about it. Ipur.
Okay, and I've talked about that, but beyond that, I mean, it's pretty sparse. So, first of all, tell me about the current state of archaeology concerning the Exodus. As far as what is the current theory, when did it happen, and what evidence or lack thereof do the archaeologists say there is?
Well, there's a verse in the Bible, I believe it's in the first chapter of Exodus, and it talks about the fact that the Hebrews, the early Israelites, were the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, had gone into Egypt, and they went there. They were given permission, and eventually they were enslaved because they grew in such a large number of people. And it says that in the second book of the Bible, in the book of Exodus, it says that they were enslaved, and they were building the store cities of Ramesses and Pithom. And there's two cities in the Nile Delta, and they know where those cities are located. And they know that during the time of Ramesses II, he reigned in the 1250 BC time period, roughly around that time. And so there was a synchronism, a connection between the looking for the story and those cities. And so many people, the main thinking is that the Exodus happened at that 1250 BC time period. And That's one synchronism. But there's another verse that's mentioned, and I think it's in Kings, and it talks about the fact that it was 480 years, I believe it is 480 years, before the time of the temple. And so that actually puts the Exodus at like 1450. And so there's been a debate. And I would say that probably more conservative people that believe in the story of the chronology that places it more, the Bible storyline, the date of 480 years from the time of the temple is where more conservative biblical scholars place the Exodus, 1446, we'll just say. And then there's this other group that look at the 1250 BC time period. And that's then the real problem is that mainstream scholars then say, well, there is no evidence for anything that looks like an Exodus or conquest at that time period of 1250 BC. And so that's where the problem lies. And that's where what I ended up, running into 12 years ago when I started to investigate this story.
Right, and I could see where this could almost lead to a crisis of faith, because we're talking about, this was no small group. We're talking about most likely somewhere around 1 to 3 million people. It's not a small group. They really should have left a decent footprint.
Right, and it's as well too is that those people didn't necessarily all live in the same neighborhood. Because the Nile is this long, 800-900 miles of river that goes all the way down to, Sudan, and so it's this long, river that had activities all up and down it on both sides of the river. So there could have been, they started out in the Delta, but there were slave lists that came from other places that had Hebrew names. And so the question, when I first started this, when you mentioned the word crisis of faith, was that I went to the very location. Now, I didn't tell you this, but, I grew up in a household, a single-parent home. My mother was a person of faith, and she read to us the stories of the Bible, and she put enormous amount of faith, and we all did, in the fact that if God, performed a miracle to save someone, we believe that would be possible, that God could help us in our little, poor family, Mm-hmm. And so as I grew up with that understanding, and the opportunity to go as I became a filmmaker, and then the thinking of going to Egypt and actually exploring these stories and going to the actual locations. You and I talked about this. The fact how cool it is to be able to, go to either Jerusalem or to the Red Sea, or in this particular case, I went to the very location that the Israelites were to have come for when Joseph invited his family to live with him in Egypt. I went to that location, and I met one of the world's premier Egyptologists, Dr. Manfred Bita, and I went to his dig site. And in the book, we've written a book about this, and I share with the fact that when I found him, I was so excited because I had been trying to reach him for quite a long time, and it was very difficult. I wasn't connecting with him. He was Austrian, and when I finally got a hold of him, or when I finally got there, it was like I found Livingston in Africa or something. I was just so happy to see him, and he was not happy at all to see me.
It kind of comes through in the film a little bit. He doesn't seem very excited.
No, but I begged him. I said, listen, I've been looking for you for so long. I've been trying to get a hold of you. Would you please let me ask you a few questions? And he agreed. And that time that I spent there, I probably spent about an hour at his dig site, and I talked with him for a very short time. And I said, is there evidence of the early Israelites here? And he said, so far, not. And I have to tell you, when he said that, it was almost like I couldn't believe my ears. It was like someone hit me with a 2x4, because I was not expecting him to say that. And what ended up happening was that began for me a huge crisis of I was conflicted, because in my mind I understood what he said, But in my heart, I was supposed to say, well, wait a minute. What am I supposed to do with this? Not only that, but I filmed it. And I brought it back, and I watched it over and over and over. And I was like, how am I going to deal with this? Here's the one guy who would know, and he was telling me no. And it was through that process. I was sitting in the edit suite one day, and on that weekend, because I was working, making commercials and other things, and I was working on this film on nights and weekends, and this is like 12 years ago. And a thought came to me. I think it was on a Saturday morning. As I looked at it, this thought came: maybe you've been believing a lie all this time. And everything that your mother and your family believed is a lie. And it was like this cold chill came over me. Mm-hmm. And it was a very dark place. And all of a sudden, another thought came to me. It's like, stop editing, get up. So I just got up and I walked to my office, and it was like I was led to this bookcase, and there was a book there that someone had given me, and I pulled the book out, and it was a book on Egypt, and I opened it up, and it was a book called Pharaohs and Kings, I believe it was. And it was a book by an Egyptologist, David Roll. Now, David Roll is an agnostic, by the way, but he had been looking at Egypt and looking at different things, and he recognized something that was happening at Manfred Betek's dig site, and he wrote about this in that book. And he started to uncover the fact that it looked as if what Manfred Betek was really doing was uncovering the Israelites, their arrival, Joseph's palace, the tombs of possibly, the patriarchs, the 12 tribes, the 12, the sons of Jacob. All this was showing up there. And then there was a story about how they grew into this large group. And what we learned, what he was able to talk about and promote, was this idea that underneath the city of Varis was another city, much older. And so this whole idea of we were looking, the Bible authors might have been telling us the location, but not the time period. You see?
Right. Tell me about this town of Varis. That was kind of right at the beginning of the movie when you started getting into the various finds and fascinating stuff.
Yes. And once again, once this started, people started rallying around this information, but this Egyptologist, David Roll, was suggesting that what he was trying to say is that there's different timelines. There's a biblical timeline and there's an Egyptian timeline, and the biblical timeline doesn't change at all. In other words, we haven't been saying there's something wrong with that, but where we thought things on the Bible would have been in Egypt, and he started challenging and questioning how Egypt had formulated its timeline. And so these evidences that nobody could see and recognize at the time of Ramesses, or the time of harvest, there were evidences for this group of people coming in and a sequence that matched the stories of the Bible, but it was earlier in what they call the Middle Kingdom. And this Varis, this city called Varis, was a city in the Middle Kingdom. And Ramesses was the next great period in Egypt's history, which is in the New Kingdom. And it was built somewhat over the top of this older city called Varis. And so the story that he was trying to say is that the biblical events were being reflected in the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, in the time of the Middle Kingdom, but that these events were matching the story, and everyone was blinded to them because of how the chronology was laid out. And that's basically what the film unravels, is it looks for 6 major events. And it looks for, the first one is the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt, Joseph and his family. Then their multiplication into a large group of people. Then it looks for the enslavement of these people. And then the fourth one is the judgment of Egypt, because the Bible says that Pharaoh refused to let these people go, and so he then gave a series of plagues. And we talked a little bit about this document called the Ippur Papyrus, or the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage. And it's a poetic document from this Middle Kingdom that has things that say very, very stunning kinds of references that reference. You don't have it. I can see if I can actually read a couple of these. Well, for example, the Bible says in Exodus 4:9, "Take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the Nile will become blood on the ground." And Ippur writes, "Behold, Egypt has fallen to the pouring of water, and he who poured water on the ground seizes the mighty in misery." Now, what I find interesting about that is that, and I've kind of stopped and I've given you a piece of evidence here in the judgment phases, but this poetic document that many people have just dismissed as there's no connection. What David Roll and others others have said, we've got a variety of different scholars in here, is that the sequence of the biblical events are happening, and people have been ignoring them. And what Roll was trying to say was that this document that Ippur has written could be like an eyewitness account in a poetic way. This is what happens when Egypt, and it talks about foreigners coming in, and there's another one. Ippur writes, well, I'll start with the Bible. The Bible says, "And all the water in the Nile turned to blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad the Egyptians could not drink water from it." And Ippur writes, "The river is blood. If you drink of it, you lose your humanity and thirst for water." And the Bible says, "And the Egyptians' livestock died. Lightning struck the earth, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. The flax and the barley were destroyed." That's in Exodus chapter 9. Ippur writes, "Gone is the barley of abundance. Food supplies are running short. The nobles hunger and suffer. Those who had shelter are in the dark of the storm." Once again, it's a passage that mirrors it. And, I mean, there's just numerous passages that we've sort of identified them. Now, this document has lots of other things it says that don't relate to the Exodus, but there's some that are very specific to it. So it's like a poetic document that says these are the things that you don't want to have happen. Don't ever go here again. And we haven't listed all of them. We probably should have listed even more of these, but I'll give you one. You remember the plague of the firstborn, the 10th plague. As right. The Bible says on Exodus 12:29, Now at midnight, the Lord struck every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and every firstborn of livestock." And Ippur writes, "Behold, plague sweeps the land. Blood is everywhere, with no shortage of the dead. He who buries his brother in the ground is everywhere. Woe is me for the grief of this time." The Bible says, "And there was a loud wailing throughout Egypt, because there wasn't a household without someone dead." And Ippur writes, "Wailing is throughout the land, mingled with lamentations." Now, this wailing could be lots of things, right? But right. The issue with patterns of evidence is that it's not the strength of just one idea, but patterns of evidence. I stopped on the fourth one. The fifth one is Exodus, that there would be an Exodus out of Egypt. And then the sixth one is a conquest of the Promised Land. And so all I did and our team did, it wasn't me. Steve Law, who was writing with me as my filmmaking writing partner and researcher, and my team, Pete Wingall, is producer, and David Wester, my executive producer. Everyone was committed to this project. And we just kept asking these questions and kept exploring and finding more details about it. And so from an apologetic standpoint, because this program is about apologetics, is what it does is it basically lets the Bible speak for itself. And so we said, what does the Bible say? And then what we did is we said, let's choose as it were, the advantage to the world, the world's the mainstream, the way that people in secular society have great opinion of is science. So if we say, okay, if you want to use the sword of science to have an exchange, then we'll use this sort of science, which is the fundamental idea of scientific method, is to look for a pattern. And if it repeats itself, or if there's some kind of connection between that pattern. And so patterns of evidence then takes this tool, this thing that most people can agree to, and uses that as the device to explore the Bible. And that's the reason why it's so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell me, okay, right at the beginning of the film, you start talking about this town of Varis and the evidence for the arrival of these Semites. And you talk about a particular house. First of all, this whole town has Semitic-looking architecture. And then all of a sudden, there's one house that is a palace.
Right.
And it's an Egyptian architecture. Tell me about this house.
Yes, that there's a palace that right in the middle of this community, and what BTEC has said is that these people were allowed to be there. They were invited there. So they weren't like they came in as conquerors and there was a battle and they took land. They actually lived, I think, in this area peaceably. They were, and so this small settlement starts to show up in the archaeology, and they can see that. But in the midst of that, there was a house that was there, and this was the main house, and it matches the type of houses that Abraham, coming from that area, I think it's up in Syria, up in that area. So it was a house that wasn't Egyptian, and that house is eventually destroyed, and because it looks like it was the main house, and then another house is built on top of it, but this time it's a palace actually, and the Bible says that as Joseph, he was very highly esteemed in Egypt, and they knew that this is a very, very special palace because they knew that the occupant though was not Egyptian, he was Semitic, and in the backyard of this palace was a pyramid tomb. And what was unusual is that there very rarely would be pyramid tombs for anyone other than a pharaoh or the queen of a pharaoh. And but this occupant of this palace was not a pharaoh. He was a Semitic ruler, and they had a statue they found the remains of it, because it actually was destroyed in this chamber where this tomb was. And they could tell that this person had red hair, he had light-colored skin, he had a throw stick, a stick of authority, and he was, it was a very large, statue. So it wasn't a small thing. It was, it was probably, I'm trying to think, 10 or 12 feet tall.
Wow.
And it was seated, so it was a very, very large. So it was an honoring, but around this pyramid tomb were other tombs as well, and I believe, according to what I've been told, that there were 11 other main tombs. There were other tombs besides that, but they were not the primary tombs. And so here we have what David Rohl was trying to tell us was that we have a Semitic person living in this area where these other Semitic people came, but he has an Egyptian palace, but he's not Egyptian, and he's a ruler, and he's given great honor by having a pyramid tomb. And the other fascinating part about this is that when they uncovered the grave and opened it up, they found out that it had been broken into twice. And I asked one time, was it grave robbers? He says no, because the bones were missing. Someone had come in there and attacked it, but normally in a tomb, you don't take bones, and
right.
And I'm not sure exactly what. I think it was probably in the latter part of Genesis, but Joseph tells his brothers he knew. The film talks about the fact that these events, Abraham, the Bible's account says that Abraham was told in advance what would happen, that his family would grow into this large people, and they would be in a foreign land, not their own, and they would be enslaved, but they would return again. So it was sort of the outline of the Exodus was there. And I think that Joseph, as I looked at the story, remembered that promise. And he said to his brothers, when I die in the future, when you, I want you to take my bones when you return back to the land with you. Don't leave them here. Take them with me. And so that was another clue, another part of the pattern that this Semitic, tomb had bones in it, then it really wouldn't have matched the story of Joseph. But the fact that, being uncovered after thousands of years and the bones were gone. And apparently, my understanding is that somebody was upset with this statue and this character or whatever, and they busted it all up. And there are references, I think, and I don't have them with me, but they were talking about they should never have let these people in the first place, I think there's a passage in, why did we let these people come in here and do all this? And if the story is that they came in, they were allowed to come in, they grew, Joseph was the beginning of that memory. And if they destroyed that tomb because of that, because it appears that somebody took and smashed that statue up. And we don't know who it is, but I'm just saying it fits the story.
Right. And you also mentioned during the film that the statue was painted. Yes.
There's photography in there of the we show what it looks like, and then we enhance it just a little bit to show you what the outline is. And it appears that there is a multicolored garment on this statue. And as some would say, Joseph had a coat of many colors. And was that representative of this character? Was it sort of bringing back the story of Joseph and his, multicolored coat? And I do know that when I've looked at other paintings, the people that came from that area, I think there's a tomb of Beni Hassan. These people had these very colorful coats, and it showed traders that were coming from that area. So this idea of having this multicolored coat might have been part of the fashion of that region or whatever. And if Joseph was given one from his father, a very special one, it sort of fits the story again. It's part of that pattern, and the film, explains that quite well.
Right. So you have this situation, you have this town of Varis, and it dates to about, would you say, 1450 BC, which is about 200...
Varis is much earlier than that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Varis, I think, is more in the 1700s. Because remember, the Exodus on the biblical timeline would be, when did they leave? And the question is how, sometimes people raise this question about, well, how long were they in Egypt? Were they in Egypt for 400 years of slavery? And the book actually talks a little bit about that as well. And we created, as you know, we created something called the Wall of Time. And it's this really beautiful wall that has 3 layers on it, 3 levels. And one level is the Egyptian timeline, and another level is the Bible timeline, and the third level is the Canaan, or the area of Israel, ancient Israel timeline. And we're able to kind of show you where this evidence lines up, as you remember in the film. And so we have to know that before the Exodus, if there was a 400-year time period in being in Egypt, then from 1250 they would have started at 1650, right?
Oh, okay. Yep.
But if it was at 1450, then they would have started at 1850. And where things start to get interesting is that you've got the Bible timeline and you have Egypt's timeline. And for a lot of people that enjoy puzzles and enjoy solving things, that's what Patterns of Evidence really gives you. The intellectual entertainment level is huge, as far as kind of understanding how this all we peel the layers off from it. And so, to not lose your audience here, because we're talking about something that's very, very visual that needs to be understood. There is we use 6 markers that are squares, and we start to show you where the biblical story is on the Bible wall, and then we start to show you on the Egyptian historical side of the wall where the evidence is starting to show up. And as you remember in the film, it's showing up earlier, sometimes by 400 years. And then we start to show how what happens when we start to dismiss certain parts of history because we have good evidence that it's not as valid as it really should be. And that's where the film takes on is Ramesses really the pharaoh of the Exodus.
Yeah. So you have this town that pops up. It's a Semitic little village, I guess, about 30,000 people, I think the film said. And they have Semitic architecture everywhere except for one building that is an Egyptian palace that has 12 graves. One of those graves, I don't even think you mentioned this earlier, but one of those graves, the one that supposedly could be Joseph's grave, was a pyramid, which is something that's only reserved. Oh, you did mention this. Something only reserved for kings or princes, or I'm sorry, pharaohs. I just botched that. Pharaohs or queens of pharaohs. And in there is a statue with somebody that has a multicolored coat, and his bones are missing. It seems like it could be some evidence for that arrival. What about the multiplication?
What ends up happening is that the archaeology shows that this city grew from that little small group that came there into one of the largest cities in the ancient world. As we said, there's 20 or 30,000 people that were there. But then I went to England and I talked with John Bimson from Trinity College there, and he told me that there were many sites. There were like 20 or 30 other sites that were like a Varis in this area. They hadn't been excavated, but they knew that they existed. And so we do know then that there's this rather large area in this part of the delta, the eastern side of it, that was showing signs of great multiplication. And so that shows that was part of what the film was trying to show, was that it wasn't just here in this one city. It was expanding. And then what we started to see is that the archaeologists started to notice that the people who lived here then went, by the way, they were quite wealthy and prosperous in the very beginning. They came with, they actually have uncovered, daggers and belts and their burials were different. People that are Semitic were buried with sheep and I think with oxen, and they were buried on their sides in a more of a fetal position. And Egyptians were always buried on their back, more like the shape of a mummy. And so they knew that these were different types of people. But when they examined them later on, they could see that the people were dying at a very young age, and that they had Harris lines, which were cracks in their bones, so they were malnourished. And these people were, they started to notice that there was a high infant mortality rate. And I think too, as I remember it, there are even in other parts of Egypt, there were these Semitic slave areas that had these, bone boxes, and that so they were saying that there was higher infant mortality than normal. And when they examined the graves of the adults, there were more women than men.
Now that's significant, because at one point Pharaoh has all the male children killed.
Yep.
And so basically what you're saying is we see this evidence of massive multiplication, and then sometime later suddenly we start seeing their culture go from somewhat wealthy to well off to suddenly they're starting to look more like they are slaves.
Yes.
And malnourished, not doing too well, and there is a big disproportion between the males and females. fascinating. It looks like the slavery that you find in the Bible.
Well, then, actually, to top that off, is that they actually started finding slave lists, or they found a slave list. It's called the Brooklyn Papyrus, and it's from an estate. I believe it's in southern Egypt, and I actually have a copy of it, and I got a document, and the man who deciphers this actually relates it to the biblical names. So he says these names are matching the biblical names. I think there's different forms, masculine and feminine, and they have the name Menachem, Asher. Asher is one of the tribes. I think there's the name Zipporah, which is the name of one of the midwives. So there's these names that are matching. So it's not. We know they're not just anybody. They've got this Semitic Hebrew type names that match the names in the Bible, and so anyway, obviously this is a very old cold case, right? But these are clues that help to look at it and say, wow, what we're seeing is that how do these people that have the same names show up on slave lists in this earlier time period, and it's starting to connect. And I'm looking here. There's another name, Issachar, and so we have two names, Issachar and Asher, two names that were parts of the sons of Israel. I mean, they were names that matched the sons of Israel who came to Egypt.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Yeah, supposedly my family line can be traced back to Issachar. My dad did this once, and he was telling me about it. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. How did you figure that out? And he explained it, but yeah, kind of interesting.
Wow. Yeah, and for people that have that capability, I do know, by the way, I've talked with the man who narrated the film. I think one of his son-in-laws has a name list that goes back all the way back to Aaron. And it's 100 and, I think 5 generations, and they have the names of everybody. Now, you'd say to yourself, now this is another apologetics interesting question. I went to Haifa in Israel, and this is for another part of this investigation, but there was a report that was submitted. There was a rabbi, there was a man who was Kohanim, Aaron, the tribe of Aaron, which we're kind of before, this is later on, but in the story of the Exodus, but Moses' brother Aaron, the tribe of Levi, this is where the priests were to come from. And what ended up happening is that there were people with the name Cohen, and they were different people, and some of them are dark, Jewish people, and others are black. I mean, they're people from Africa that are saying that they're from this tribe. They're Kohanim. They're from the priestly line, and in order to sort of come to a settlement of is this even true, they decided to take their DNA, and they took DNA from several hundred. I'm not sure how many it was, 400 or 500 people around the world, people that were Jewish, but they didn't look like they were related at all. Some were light colored, some were dark, some were black, and they found out that all of them were related to the same ancestor. And so, and it was proven. I mean, they published it in a science magazine, and I went and interviewed that person, Dr. Skrecki in Haifa, who did this. And so it's been submitted, into the world. So what we find out is that from a DNA scientific standpoint, these people who say they're part of this, actually, their DNA actually stands up to that test. Now, what's fascinating about it is how many generations back do you think it is to the time of the Exodus?
Oh wow! Oh, I have no idea.
I'm going to give you a clue, an easy clue. Let's just say a generation is 30 years. Okay? By the time you're 30, you have a son or a daughter. And then by the time they're 30, they have a child. But let's just keep with the sons. So one father has a son, and then the next one has a son, and the next one has a son. And so it would be 30 years a generation. Well, if you divide 300 or 3,500 years or 3,600 years, let's just use 36, you would go back 120 generations. Now, what's amazing about this is that 120 generations back to that time, when you put 120 people, if you go to a movie theater, for example, that's a very small theater. If you're in a church and there's 120 people sitting there, it's not necessarily that large of a congregation, but that's how many generations, that's how few of generations, because it seems like it would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It seems like it'd be way long time ago.
Right.
Yeah, but it's not. It's only 120 generations back to that story.
Huh.
To the beginning of those events. And that's what this DNA researcher found out, too. The DNA could show the generational kind of variations, and he found out to be between 105 to 130 or 40 generations back in the different, in the DNA.
Another thing you bring up in the video that we've kind of passed over it, no pun intended, but you mention also, in the book of Exodus, when Joseph interprets that dream for Pharaoh, Pharaoh appoints him basically as his right-hand man and sets him in charge of gathering a massive storehouse of food that's going to last him for 7 years during lean times. And during that 7 years of famine, the wealth of all the regions surrounding Egypt seems to shift to the Pharaoh. Is there evidence of that wealth shift around the same time as the city of Varis and these other events?
You're asking the question?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is yes, and this was something that once again they found that there was during this particular period there was what was called nomarchs, and they had tremendous wealth. So Egypt basically didn't have one great pharaoh. It had almost like a number of godfathers that worked their way all the way down the Nile, and they had territories. But something happened in one particular point in history where all the wealth is concentrated with the pharaoh. And a lot of Egyptian history books, they don't have any explanation for it. But if we look at the story of the Bible, and we look at the famine, policy, was that eventually, because of the fact that Pharaoh, through Joseph's direction, gathered and saved grain, just for people's, when the famine came, they gave all their money for food, and then they started selling their land, and then eventually they sold themselves. And that then gives some type of explanation why all the power of Egypt went to the Pharaoh and transferred to the Pharaoh.
Right. Okay. Well, what about the conquest of Canaan? So there was the judgment. We did talk about the Ippur papyrus, and there was actually quite a bit of other evidence that you mentioned in the film, I believe. But then, they crossed the Red Sea, and they spend their 40 years in the wilderness. Then there's this time of conquest where Joshua enters into the promised land. That was awesome. That was a really neat part of the film. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, it is a pretty cool part of the film. And actually, I just want to share with the listeners that we spent, over a year just working on the 7 minutes of conquest. And one thing that I realized that was amazing was that we had the plan for the the dig site. We had the plans. In fact, I actually have documents from the very first dig site, the very first digging that was done there, and I was able to get that document. It was a book that was printed. It's all in German, and it's Ernst Zellen who did this book, and we found it in Jerusalem, and we were able to get it. And we were able to then take the plans, and we copied the dig reports and rebuilt Jericho exactly in the size and in the place that it was in the ancient time where it is. So the mountains are in the right place, the city is in the right shape. We've tried to rebuild everything in the right dimensions, so that when you look at Jericho, or when you look at this earlier city in Egypt, the Varis, you're looking at the actual recreation from the dig reports of what the city would have looked like. And we've used this Terrigen software that allows us to, recreate mountains and sky and everything. So it's possible that you're seeing something that's very, very close to what it might have been thousands of years ago. And at this location, this goes back to this big question of when things happen. If we go back to the idea that Ramesses was the pharaoh of the Exodus, and that's what everyone in mainstream, so most of the time, anybody who's talking about these stories and they're telling you there's no evidence for it, they are absolutely correct. There is no evidence for the Bible in the time they're looking for it. But once again, what these other scholars were telling me is that, and what the film is about, is if you look earlier, there's the entire pattern for the conquest shows up, but it's earlier than when people are suggesting it should be. And we see evidence of a Jericho, of a city with high walls, and we start to see that existed at the right, matching all the other evidence, it comes in the right sequence. So we go through, remember the 6 steps. We have arrival, multiplication, slavery, judgment, Exodus, and then we move to the conquest. That 6th step is in the right sequence, matching the evidence in Egypt. But it's up in that conquest of the Canaan area. It's up in that. And we start to see that the cities that were supposed to be there are there. And then something happened. Something amazing happened in the history of that part of the world. So much so that it changed from the Middle Bronze Age to the Late Bronze Age. And what happened is that many of the cities were destroyed and burned. and what does that match? It matches the story of the conquest.
Right. Tell me about Jericho.
Well, Jericho, had a lower retaining wall. The Bible doesn't communicate other than it was a great fortified city. And I'm trying to think of the details. We were able to take the remains of the city of Jericho and build it. But it says, the Bible says that the spies went into Jericho, and they were kind of casing the place, right? And we know the story of a woman there. Her name is Rahab, or Rahab is the Jewish pronunciation. And she helps them, and she hides them and protects them. And then she tells them that we know what has happened, we've heard about this, and she wants protection, and they give her protection. And this is an important part in the story of the conquest. And she's told to put a scarlet out her window, scarlet, cord, or and so that when her whole family should stay there. And what they found out, these Germans, when they excavated this area, the Bible says that when the walls fell, they did not fall. Her house was built into the wall, and her house did not fall. And when the Germans excavated this area, they found that a portion of the wall didn't fall. It had fallen in all the other areas, but in this one area, it didn't fall. And so it matches the biblical story. And when the other archaeologists that had been there, Kenyan, they said that something caused it to, something caused the walls to fall. But then it wasn't an earthquake, though, because the city was set on fire. And that's exactly what they found. The city was burned, and you can still see the burn layers today. And there is a grain that they uncovered, and the grain was, burned, but I don't think it was not completely usable, but they could see the burned grain. Now, why this, and that was found all over the city, and why that was important was the Bible told them, in the Bible, God tells them, don't take the grain. Don't take anything. This is an offering to me. And these little details, the fact that there was grain there in the first place, said that it happened at the spring of the year. And that's exactly when the Bible says that it actually happened. It just gathered in the grain from the winter crop. And so, obviously, there's probably more details than I'm even sharing here, but those are the types of things that Patterns of Evidence starts to explore. And once again, I'm a filmmaker. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm talking to people on both sides of this story, but I am looking for the story. I'm letting the Bible tell us what it's speaking for itself, and then we're going out and we're saying, is there any evidence that matches the story? Let's not say where it has to be. Let's just see if it can fall into the right place. Let's just see if we can find a piece of evidence. Then what happens next? What happens next? And as you saw in the film and in the book, what we're hearing from these different archaeologists and Egyptologists are saying there is a pattern, and no one's willing to admit it. And this film comes along and builds a case that says, okay, let's let the rest of the world know that this pattern exists. And so now you know, as you watch the film, that when people say there's no evidence for the stories of the Exodus or the conquest, there's a whole other story that can be told.
Right. And you make a very compelling case with that movie. Guys, if you haven't seen this, you really got to go pick it up. I mean, I really can't recommend this enough. It is such a good film. And really, I mean, I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. I'm sure you can find it in a great many different places. I found it, believe it or not, at Walmart. I went up to Wally World and I found it there for $13. That was a steal. I've watched it twice and I'm probably going to watch it a third and a fourth time. My family loved it. And today, Tim and I, we've barely scratched the surface in all the interesting finds, these patterns of evidence that have been discovered that really do match perfectly the Exodus. I mean, it is fascinating. It makes your hair stand up. I don't know, maybe I'm a geek, but I got very excited. I mean, there were multiple times when I was cheering for the video because it was just like, yeah, that is so cool. So, I can't recommend it enough. Tim, one of the things you kind of bait a little bit with a little commercial that's part of the features of an up-and-coming film. I know you don't want to say too much, but what can you say about this up-and-coming almost sequel?
Oh, okay. Well, just let me say one thing, is that if people want to get the film right now, too, they can go to patternsofevidence.com, and there's a store locator there. We've actually, had some challenges with Amazon, because I think we sold out a whole ton of it. They're trying to fill in the inventory there. So if they can't get it there, they can look at the other options, Christian bookstores, like you said, Walmart, or even our own website where they can purchase the product. Now, you talked about other products and other things that are coming. I'll just say that right now we have a movie event kit for churches if they want, or for colleges, or for any outreach that people can purchase. They can look on the website for that. There's coming a small group study series that Kevin Sorbo and I are going to be. We filmed it and we just got to cut it together, which will be a 6-part small group series to sort of to go through parts of the film and do a Bible study. And ask these questions about how do you deal with the crisis of faith, and is it okay to have questions, and then how do you work your way through it so that you can find answers? And I think that's part of what our company Thinking Men Films is trying to help all of us to do. And then you mentioned, I'll just tell you another thing. I'm working on a series called Young Explorers, right now.
Yeah. What's up with that?
Yeah, well, it's I could tell we had all these kids coming, and they were so excited about all this, and they just love Egypt and love the Bible, and they're interested in these, how is this all connected? And I decided to make a series which is a little more dramatic. It's probably I'm not sure how many hours it's going to be, but it's probably between 2 to 4 hours long. And it's a multi-part series. It could be curriculum, homeschool type material. It can be just watch it with your kids and go through the Bible. I think it's going to be really powerful. We're really happy with it. It's kids 8 to 16 years old go on this adventure. They become young explorers for patterns of evidence. And then finally, to answer your question, you ask about patterns of evidence. The Exodus is the first, but there are multiple other possibilities that we have. And the next one, working title, is Moses, Patterns of Evidence Moses, which we're going to look at the life of Moses, look at the journey. Where did he flee? Where was this mountain that God told him to go to? And then when he goes back, he has to bring these people through the wilderness, and they've got to go, what sea did they cross? Where did these things happen? And we're going to explore the different potentials for the route. We'll look at the mountains and look at evidences for this, and then what happened at that mountain that many believe changed the world. This amazing event where these people met with God, and he gave them these commandments and gave them, made a covenant with these people and said, you're to be my people. And so that's what we're going to explore in the next film. And we're really, really excited about that. We spent a lot of time on that already, and we've got a lot of the footage in the can, and we're just trying to keep this thing moving forward. And that's why it's great to have everyone's help. If they like this, they can go to, like I said, patternsofevidence.com and learn more. We're going to try to create a lot more resources for people. And it's the kind of film, as you could probably say, that you could show it to just about anybody because it's really balanced. It allows people to, on different viewpoints. It's very courteous in the sense that, we're not putting anybody down, but we're just challenging people to think and to look at this evidence and to consider it. And I think that's kind of where we are today.
Right, yeah. Wow, how exciting. Now, let me ask you this. Obviously when my listeners purchase this video, if they get it from Walmart or Amazon, you or Thinking Man Films probably makes a little bit less. If they buy it from your website, do you guys do a little bit better?
Well, that's an awkward question because we're trying to support everybody, but I guess people can figure out the math for themselves. But I think that you need to go where you can get it sent to you immediately. And right now there's some shipping challenges that we're having in other locations. So I'm glad we did so well. We were the #1 documentary on Amazon for the month of August, and so we just had great interest, and we're trying to get all of our partners to keep the product in flowing and everything. But we got plenty of product. You just need to check that website and see where's the most convenient and where can you get it, now. And
right.
And we have it streaming too, by the way. For if your listeners want to watch it, rent it, they can get a streaming version. And I think we're on iTunes, and like I said, we're at christiancinema.com. They can go there. So there's a variety of places that they can get streaming as well. So
okay. Yeah, and I apologize. I didn't mean that to be awkward. I guess my whole point in saying that is I understand the costs that go into making something good, making a good product. And when you, the person that makes it, is allowed to make that money back, that encourages you to make another that is just as good, if not better. And so basically, it's a way for my listeners to encourage you more.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to go on a limb and guess that I am sure that you probably get more blessing out of it when they purchase it from your website versus Amazon or Walmart. because more of it is going to go to Thinking Man Films and give you a better budget than to pursue this even more in the future?
Well, we also have we have other resources on our website that people can look at. There's lecture series. There's the books. We have another book called Exodus, Myth or History that we just that's coming out in October. That's our national release for that. That's David Roll's book, and we're going to be producing. We hope to produce more products in this area. We've got them kind of in queue here, and so there's a lot of we're looking for people to get behind us. We also have a Thinking Man's the Thinker's news or email that I have. You can sign up, and I'll send out updates. Every month, several times a month, I'll send out updates to our thinkers. We've got thousands of people that have signed up for that, and they're kind of on the inside track about what's happening, and I'll give them links, and so we're trying to continue to give people tools. So that's what I think that this film does. Wouldn't you say it just gives a tool for people, very unusual tool. You can show this to your skeptic friends, and they're going to like it. I mean, I've found we've had people that are atheists and give us great reviews. I was just really surprised. They might not agree with everything, but they really like the film. And right now, I mean, we've been getting really high ratings, and all that work of going and looking and digging this stuff up. And I'm going to be honest, nobody knows if how much of this we've gotten right, but there's enough of it, and we don't try to say, we try to be declarative. We basically say, okay, you guys can decide, but at least I'm going to tell you what happened to me in the last 12 years. This is what I've seen. I'm reporting it. You guys can decide for yourself. And I think that all of us need to be thinkers, and we need to take Scripture and look at it and understand it. A lot of people have a very shallow understanding. I think, people don't understand the Old Testament. They don't even look at it very often. And Jewish people would not call it the Old Testament. It's not old to them. Like it needs to be replaced. They're very offended by that terminology. But for clarity of what I'm saying is that the first books in the Bible, from Genesis, through to what's the last one? I can't remember.
Deuteronomy.
Well, that's the Torah.
Micah.
Micah, yeah. You look through all of that. A lot of people never ever really consider those, but those are hugely important. Those are foundational, and I'm fascinated by these events. And as I said, they didn't happen that long ago.
Right. 120 generations.
Yeah. As the crow flies, right?
Right. Where can people sign up for your newsletter?
They can go to patternsofevidence.com. Patternsofevidence.com. And they can sign up, and we've got a lot of things we're trying to put forward, and we're just thankful to have you and your support, and anyone else who's out there. I think what we're trying to do is give people tools, and I think that there's a lot of people that have different types of crises of faith, and this particular journey for me, I could have basically come to a point where I just said, you know what, I don't believe anymore. But fortunately, that didn't happen, and I was able to work that out. And that's what I think we need to basically do. There's a Bible scholar by the name of Dr. Walt Kaiser, and he's been supporting the film. And he said, a lot of times we have questions, and he says, what you got to do is put that on. You don't put it on the front burner. You put it on the back burner. You let it simmer for a while, and eventually things will happen where you basically be able to maybe have an answer for some of those questions. And for a long time, this mystery of this information has been sitting there, and a lot of people have had no answers for it. And Patterns of Evidence, I think, has been a project that, for the first time, I believe, has given some answers and helps people to have an alternative to the type of programs or types of things they might have seen on other channels that, on cable TV that are critical of the Bible. Now, this film, I think you had mentioned that everybody should have it. I believe that obviously I'm the filmmaker, but I've spent 12 years working hard, and our whole team did a lot of sacrifice to basically tell this story. And if you've got young, your family needs to see this so that your kids, when they go off to university or go to college or go anywhere, go into life, they're going to know that the Bible declares itself to be a historical book. And what you're going to find with this film and our own, the book that tells story patterns, is that it's matching. It's coming up historically, matching the evidence, and that's a big deal.
Yeah, amen. Absolutely. Really quick, I want to correct myself. I said Micah was the last book. It's Malachi, the French prophet. Yeah, the French prophet Malachi. We both know better, but Malachi
could be the
and
Italian
Micah,
prophet Malachi.
Oh yeah, that's what. Yeah, the Italian prophet Malachi. But anyway, sorry, I had to throw that in there. Well, Tim, wow, what a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm glad we were able to finally connect, and, we can do this again.
All right, there you have it. Timothy Mahoney, the film Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. You gotta pick this up. Wow, what a ride. What an amazing film. Very well done. There's so many films that are being cranked out in the Christian community that are just kind of subpar. You know what I'm saying? You watch it and you're like, well, that was kind of neat, but can you say low budget, and these types of things? Well, this film, wow, he did such a good job. It is such a quality piece of work, and the evidence that he brings to the table, the archaeological evidence, we only covered a small sampling of it here today. You really got to check that out. So yeah, Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, and it's by Timothy Mahoney. Guys, upon releasing this podcast, today being October 12th, next Sunday, I will be embarking on a mission trip. I'm going to see if I can't have my wife release some podcasts while I'm gone. I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks. To be honest, I'm a little nervous. I'm going somewhere that I've been told I'm not allowed to disclose until after the journey is over. Is there danger involved? Yes, there is danger involved. I've talked to some people and said, oh, you'll be fine. No worries, nothing to worry about. And I've talked to other people who raised their eyebrows and looked at me like, whoa, you're crazy. You're going to do that? Yes, I am. I never anymore, I don't ask for tithes, but friends, I could use your prayers. Please, over the next few weeks, please pray for me. Pray for the safety of my team and I as we do what we're going to be doing. And rest assured, I'll be telling you all about it when I get back. Pray for our safety. Also, pray for success. Pray that God uses us mightily. I've never done anything like this before. And so I desperately need your prayers. I am going to be completely out of my element. Okay, so I'm pushing myself to new levels on this one. And yes, I could really use your prayers. I'm definitely nervous. I'm also very excited. Everything is in God's hands. But once I tell you what I did, yes, some of you will be like, oh, no big deal, whatever. And others of you are going to be thinking, oh my goodness, you're crazy. That's nuts. Yeah, I'm leaning more towards the nuts side, but we're going to do this, and praise God. I pray that the gospel goes forth and just as many people as we can reach. I'm praying that God uses us and brings us back home safely without any major issues. All right, guys. Well, next week, the podcast I'll be releasing, we're going to start talking about this Messianic movement, the Hebrew roots movement. I've had so many requests over the years to get into this, and I've been a little reluctant, but I have recorded now 3 podcasts on the subject, and I think that will complete that series. So look forward to part 1 coming out next week. And then, yes, I'm also looking to potentially have a few guests on in the future on this subject as well, because it is a fairly large subject. But whatever the case, look forward to that. And with that, I love you guys. And, I'll be talking to you next week on a pre-recorded podcast. Again, please be praying for me as a team of guys and I are going to be doing something a little gutsy in another country. God be praised, God be glorified, and God be with us. With that, I love you guys, and we'll talk to you next week.